The understanding that I think is right in front of us, if we'll just acknowledge it, is that we have the means to solve every problem we face, no matter how big or scary they seem. Hi everybody, I'm Nathan Gardner, and this is We Can Remake the World, a podcast about people who are changing the world and how you can help. I was talking with a friend recently, and one of us said, what a crazy few years the last few months have been. I'm starting to feel like we'll refer to 2020 as more of a decade than a year. I mean, doesn't it feel like time is different? Like every week is about a month's worth of life or so, and sometimes more. It feels like so much has changed in such a short period of time, and we've all had to find about 100 new ways to cope with whatever experience each day brings. Sometimes it feels like we're fired up and we're ready to take on the world, and sometimes you just want to stay in bed all day and turn off. I've definitely experienced both extremes. I think often about my family who work in hospitals and schools every day and the challenges that they must be facing and people like them. I also think about friends who are musicians and performers and how difficult it must be for them to be staying positive and to rely on unemployment to get through this time. And then I've also had moments of total inspiration where I'll put a bunch of time into a small project that I'll share, or something bigger maybe that I'm building, hoping it will give someone a brighter moment in their day and lift their spirits. And then I have these days of just wanting to or needing to do absolutely nothing, just so I can have a moment to process and be still. Anyone else out there experiencing moments like that? It feels like making space for that stillness just to be is so important right now. It's really helped me. But here's the deal. No matter what the circumstances are, we have a choice when we're faced with challenges. We can see them as only negative and stay focused on what's holding us back. Or we can see them as an opportunity to learn, to grow, to challenge our old ideas, to change, and to get better because of those challenges. I want to talk today about why challenges are good for us, and more about this choice that we all have. I think one of the most challenging aspects of life on planet Earth these days is the fact that we're being asked to face some very difficult truths, some pretty big ones too. And this goes beyond just the current situation, I think, with lockdowns and health concerns. This is also about some of the social and political climate that we find ourselves in and the environmental situation. We're finding out that there are much bigger gaps between who we'd like to be and who we currently are than maybe we realized. There are truths around the way that minorities, and specifically Black Americans, as we've seen over this summer, are treated in the United States and around the world that many of us have not fully had to reckon with at this level until now. There are truths around the situation with our world and our environment and how fragile many of the world's ecosystems and species have become that are not easy to face. There are truths around the deep level of corruption, both in business and government, that are coming to light. It's a lot. There's no denying it. And even though it's not easy to look with this kind of hard truth at some of these things, there's one question I think that is so important to ask, which is, wouldn't we rather know than not know? Wouldn't we rather be aware of where things stand so that we can really face it and do something about it? I think becoming aware of all of these situations as they really are is so important if we want to make the meaningful change that we often talk about. That's one benefit, I think, of challenges like these. We have the chance to really acknowledge where we stand so that we can really make a course correction that lasts. We can choose to let these circumstances and this self-awareness on a larger scale to inspire us to be better, rather than keep us stuck in fear and worry. There's a step beyond the sort of blame and concern over current situations. And that step beyond is, okay, what do we do about it? What can we do about it? What are the answers? What are the solutions? And if we let ourselves make that leap from that kind of first step to that second step, then we get more proactive, we get more empowered, and then we can really do something. What if this time, as challenging as it feels, is not meant to make us feel hopeless, but to empower us with the truth so that we can finally make foundational changes? Isn't that more exciting? Doesn't that sound better than, oh man, this is all just so hard and impossible? And I think naturally, when we're in a phase of becoming more self-aware, it's like our flaws get bigger and louder. As though once you make that commitment to make improvements, everything about your life that doesn't feel right anymore, that doesn't line up with the positive changes you want to make, suddenly feels all wrong. It can be this kind of flood of self-judgment, I think, if you're not careful. And it's a natural experience. Have you ever been through a detox of any kind? Or maybe you've decided to change your habits. Maybe you changed up the way that you were eating, or you made a commitment to think more positively. And you know these things are good for you, but when you're taking your first steps, it's like the volume is turned way up on your bad habits, on your shortcomings, your flaws. And suddenly it feels like everything about you is wrong. And you get this sense that you needed to make those changes or start that detox way more than you realized. I've personally been through all kinds of detoxes, especially when it comes to food, and it took me years to really transform my relationship to food, which was pretty unhealthy when I was growing up. I mean, I grew up on fast food and junk food and all kinds of candy and processed stuff. I built emotional ties to food that were really destructive and were not good for my body. And it wasn't easy to shift my experience with eating that way to something where I was really valuing my body and valuing the nutrition in the food that I was eating. It took time. And at first, it was like everything I was doing was wrong. How could I have eaten this way for so long? Why didn't I make changes sooner? I would get so hard on myself sometimes as my self-awareness grew. And it began to feel like a lot of my thoughts and emotions defaulted to something negative or something critical, which I also realized was a habit of sorts. I had built that pattern into the way I was living too. I realized how often I was reinforcing the negative aspects of my life and how often I was telling myself that I was limited or that things were too challenging, that I was too tired for this or that. And I really began to realize how deep some of this stuff went and how big the changes that I needed were in order to live the life that I wanted to live and in order to move through my world the way that I wanted to. I sort of wonder if we're going through a cultural detox in a way. It's like our desire to be and do better is so strong that every single aspect of our current world that doesn't line up with what we feel like we really want to see is shouting out to us in the loudest volume to acknowledge it so we can make some changes. And it's not easy to kind of get through that phase without feeling overwhelmed. But just speaking from personal experience, as I continued to make the commitments I was making, and as I took real steps toward changing the way that I was eating, the way that I was thinking, things got easier. I stuck with it. And I decided to allow those challenges to help me to grow into a more self-disciplined person with my thoughts and my habits. And even though that first phase wasn't easy, I wouldn't trade that difficulty for anything. Because now I feel like I'm so much stronger and so much happier because of the commitments I made to get honest about where I was and what it was going to take to bring me to where I wanted to go. And it brings me back to where we are now, this time where we as a culture and as a global society are facing a lot of challenges and a lot of things that we can't ignore any longer. And because we're so connected globally, it's like our collective self-awareness is growing. So we're in this phase of the beginning of a detox, in a way, where we're just starting to take a look around and say, okay, this is what we've got to clean up. This is what we've got to change. And those are the things that seem the biggest and the loudest right now, because we haven't taken those next steps to find the solutions and make the behavioral changes that will bring us into that new way of being that we want to get to, individually and together. Another way of looking at it, I think, is it's kind of like life in your early 20s. Stick with me for a minute. I mean, when you're in your early 20s, maybe you're in college, maybe you aren't, but suddenly, at least this is what happened to me, you start to realize that the world is much bigger than it seemed when you were 16, 17, or 18, and now it's time to make some choices about who you are and who you want to be and what you want to do with your life, the direction that you want to take. And it's time now to take responsibility for yourself. No matter what happened to you when you were young, you're the one calling the shots and building life on your terms. I personally was a mess in my early 20s. I don't know if that's true for any of you, but it felt like I had to overhaul my entire life in order to get back on track. There was some stuff that I went through when I was a teenager and even younger that was kind of tough, and it had built some habits and some mindsets into me and the way that I dealt with relationships that were not so healthy. And sometimes I knew what the better choice was. For example, stop drinking vodka. But I would often ignore that better choice over and over until I finally listened to myself and made the change. I stumbled so many times, and I lost some friends along the way, but I also made some new ones. And these people were much more aligned with the foundation that I wanted to build for my life and the kind of relationships I wanted to have. Eventually, I got back on track with a whole new way of relating to my life over the time that it took to make those changes. I think there's a tendency, especially with young people, to know better, but to make the less than greatest choice anyway. Sometimes it's a destructive choice, self-destructive or destructive to others, because it's easier or because it feels fun in the moment. But eventually, if we're going to make that growth happen that we know we need, we'll listen to that voice that's telling us to be and do better. And this is what I'm talking about. What if we as a society are moving from a kind of adolescence into adulthood in a way, if we continue the metaphor? Maybe we're growing up through some hard lessons and we're finally ready to put into action the things that we know are good for us, without pretending like they don't exist, without ignoring the habits that we know are self-destructive. It's like finally we're ready to face the changes that we need to make. Things like honoring our planet and protecting wildlife. Things like choosing cooperation over competition and corporate profit. Things like treating all humanity as equal rather than keeping our power structures set up in the way that they are so that some are empowered and some are disempowered. These are things we've known are good for us and would make us a better culture and a better world for a long time. Now, are we finally ready to acknowledge that and act on it and build a world that reflects that understanding? It's okay to go through that phase of knowing better and still not doing better, but isn't it time now to look around and see the world that we've been building based on our old ways of thinking that aren't working enough so that we can really take meaningful steps forward into a different way of being, into growing up from a certain perspective? And again, this is the benefit of times like this, to see things clearly, to make clear choices based on our growing understanding, and then to take action. Action which brings us closer to who we want to be as individuals, as cultures, and globally. And that's the good news. We finally might do something. We're getting a lot closer, don't you think? There's optimism in that feeling of no longer being able to sustain the status quo. That can be positive. All of this pressure and all of these challenges are going to lead us into making the changes we've known we've needed for years. I mean, look back over the last several decades. People have been calling for these changes for a while. It's exciting to move into that place of saying, all right, I'm going to be the solution where I am, because I'm not going to stay stuck in these old patterns. I'm not going to be part of this world that's based on dysfunction and built on inequality. I'm going to be part of the new world that's coming from the challenges we've been facing. Let's each choose to be change makers where we are and be part of building that new world, that new way of thinking and being. It's time for us to make the better choice. And in order to do that, we've got to look around and face all of the choices we've been making that don't give us what we want. And what do we want, really? We want to be healthy. We want to be safe. We all want to choose our life path without others criticizing us or trying to cut us down. We want to be connected to others through positive, open relationships. We want to feel like our lives have meaning and that we're contributing something that matters. We all, I think, want to have purpose and passion in our work and in our daily lives. We want to treat ourselves and each other well. We want to have enough to eat, and we want others to have that too. We want to respect our planet and take care of it so that we can continue living life as we currently know it. And I believe we each want to be part of something greater than ourselves, and part of a community that values us. These are all relatively simple things, but the version of our world where every single person on the planet enjoys these things sometimes feels pretty far off when you take a look around. But like any person in their early 20s would tell you, or any nutritionist or maybe therapist who's working with someone on changing their thoughts and behaviors, you've got to acknowledge who you are and where you are and what your habits are now before you can really make meaningful change. We cannot know where we're headed or what we wish to be if we can't face where we currently are. And it doesn't have to be overwhelming. It doesn't have to be huge. Let's look at some examples of aspects of life that we've changed in the not too distant past that have made our lives better. We have evidence of people changing their behaviors, their habits, their beliefs, so that we can all experience a better world. Think of smoking. People used to smoke constantly, thinking that it had no negative impact. It was just part of the social norm. Cigarette companies used to say smoking was actually good for you, and people believed it at first. They had no reason to doubt them at the time. Camel encouraged smoking as an aid to digestion, and at one point roughly half of American adults, including half of the physicians in the United States, were regular smokers. And what's interesting about this is the mainstream didn't see smoking as negative, but there was research that had been around since the 1920s that linked cigarette smoking to lung cancer. So that research had been around for about 30 years. Some people knew the truth, and over time, that truth grew, but it took a little while. The Surgeon General's report of 1964 in the United States finally sank into public consciousness and began to change people's ways of relating to smoking and how they thought about smoking. Smoking in the US has declined ever since, down to about 13.7 or so percent of adults in 2018, according to the Centers for Disease Control in the US. So it took about 100 years before the first research about the truth behind smoking made its way into the public consciousness enough to get most people to stop doing it because it was a self-destructive habit, something that caused health harm rather than health good. And even when the mainstream began to adopt this idea that smoking was not good for you in the 1960s, it still took about another 50 years before Americans really made massive cutbacks in how much they smoked. But we got there. And we had that period of making the choice that wasn't as good for us, even though we knew better for a little while. But we got there. If we hadn't found and faced the truth, ignoring the reassurances from the tobacco companies and the misinformation that was in those marketing campaigns, many of us would probably still be smoking cigarettes and creating major problems for our bodies. It wasn't an easy truth to face at first. I mean, it was deeply entrenched in our culture and how we did things, how we lived. And we had to really challenge the official story around the health of cigarette smoking, which I think is true for us now, too. It's not easy for us to face some of the deep foundational change we need. It's just kind of how we do things. And there are a lot of companies and interest groups out there that will tell us that everything's fine and the change we need isn't really that necessary, but it's time to challenge that and really take ownership for ourselves, learn what we can learn, so that over time we can change our habits and create a better way, in the same way we did with cigarette smoking. And it's really easy for a lot of us these days to say, I mean, it's obvious. Of course, cigarette smoking is bad for you. And to point a finger at those who were smoking in the 50s and 60s, and some of the folks who even smoke now, and say, how could you do that? How could you not see that this is bad for you? But it's important to remember not to get caught up in that blame and to realize that it takes time for new understandings to permeate our culture and the way that we behave. A smoker who's trying to quit doesn't benefit from beating up on themselves every time they want a cigarette. And this carries over into any challenge, into any new behavior that we're building into our individual lives or into our cultures. Our challenge is this: to face ourselves and our current situation without getting too caught up in hopelessness, blame, or resentment for who we've been and what we've done so far. We've all been through difficult times where we had to acknowledge that we weren't behaving our best. We knew better, and it took us some time to make the changes we needed to make, and that's okay. It takes vulnerability to fess up to bad behavior, and it takes compassion from others as you work on yourself, and it takes strength to make these changes. And I think that's where we are now. We're in a vulnerable place, and we need to build ourselves and each other up so that we can find our way to the other side without getting caught up in self-blame or in pointing fingers at others. Imagine if you made a decision to eat better and you told your friends or your family that this was a decision that you were making. And imagine that those people close to you kept telling you that it wasn't possible for you to make these changes. You can't get to the other side of this. You've made too many bad choices for too long, and you don't deserve to be healthier or to have better habits that make you feel better. You don't deserve to experience what you're striving for because of who you've been in the past. And I think this is what we do to ourselves as a culture, as a global community, all the time. We're constantly saying that we can't reach the other side of these problems because we've been so bad for so long. How many times have you seen or heard in movies that humans are hopeless? We're wired for war and self-destruction, and selfishness to the point of harming others is just human nature. It's just who we are. We keep telling ourselves this message, and I don't buy it. I just don't. I think people want to grow into something bigger and better than we've been, bigger and better than we've found yet on our planet so strongly, and we just haven't been willing to take a hard look at who we are with enough honesty to really make the changes that are necessary. And that's part of it. But I think we also haven't given ourselves the compassion to let go of the past so that we can move into a better way of being, which is just as important of a step. So now I think our challenge is to accept the difficult truths of the time that we're in without getting lost in despair or powerlessness and without getting caught up in anger and blame for the behavior that we've maintained up until now. Our challenge is to move beyond that way of thinking and to see every new revelation and every new understanding, even when they're difficult, as an opportunity to create something better, to make meaningful changes so that we can truly stand in the world we wish to inhabit, rather than getting stuck in the world that we're in. Our challenge is to focus on the long-term goal beyond the short-term bumps in the road. And they might be big, hairy, nasty, scary bumps, but they're still bumps in a longer road. This is, I think, what our best teachers and changemakers from history have done. Gandhi believed in human brotherhood so much that he bet his life and others' lives, the lives of his community and supporters, on the belief that their oppressors wouldn't continue to violently control them if they didn't physically fight back. If they gave no reason for the violence, then the violence would stop. He forced those who were trying to control his people to acknowledge their humanity and refused to attack those who would not attack back. Gandhi put his faith in the better part of human nature, not the destructive part of human nature, and that's how he changed his world. Martin Luther King saw the truth of his people's situation. He was not in the dark about it at all, but he spoke of a vision for a world beyond the unspeakable hardship that was being inflicted on the Black community in the United States and around the world. And he created a movement which changed that world forever because of his vision. He acknowledged the hardship and spoke truth about it, but chose to see beyond it and invited others to see past it with him. Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and other gay and lesbian and queer activists got mad one night at the Stonewall Inn in New York City and decided enough was enough. It was time to speak out and demand equality for them and their community, no matter what the consequences were and no matter how long it took for the culture to see them for who they were. And the culture eventually changed. It took a few decades, but we are in a very different place now than we were back in the 1970s when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community. And we'd be silly if we look at any of these examples and say that it was easy for these folks to see past their immediate circumstances into a better world. But in each example, a better world came about. And sometimes it wasn't even the people who built this vision that got to see it come to fruition, but it did. Can we now hold a vision for a better world despite the challenging circumstances that we're in and do our best to line up with that vision every day and be the example of the possibilities in whatever way we can? We have the opportunity now to use the inspiration and examples from our greatest leaders to see a world beyond the one we face right now, and to line up with it and start to bring it into clarity. And just like we have examples from these great leaders, we also have examples of how quickly things can change for the better if we just get ourselves onto the right path now. When it comes to the environment, for example, we've seen that Mother Nature knows how to bounce back when we give her the room to do so. There are a couple examples, I think, that are worth digging into just to inspire us and remind us what's possible. In 1995, biologists in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States noticed a lack of health in the local ecosystem, which means plants and animals. And the biologists decided to bring gray wolves back to the park for the first time in a long time. Gray wolves were once one of the top predators of the Yellowstone National Park area, but were hunted to extinction in the 1920s and 30s. Gray wolves were brought from Canada, where they were still wild, and reintroduced into Yellowstone, into the park. And within just a few years, biologists noticed that the entire ecosystem began to recover. And this wasn't just animal life. Plant life, which is directly impacted by the balance of the ecosystem and by the balance of the animal population, also began to thrive. The species that began to recover were all across the board, including trees and other plants all around the park, beavers, which had almost completely disappeared, ravens, bears, lynx, even insects and other bugs, eagles, coyotes. They all began to show signs of thriving again that they hadn't before the wolves returned. Biologists believe that the gray wolves played an essential role in the ecosystem of Yellowstone, and once they had the good sense to understand that that's what the system needed and replaced that missing link, then everything began to bounce back, and overpopulation from some of the species that wolves hunted went down, so plant life recovered, and that impacted animals who depended on that plant life, and the whole system just began to regenerate. I think this is so inspiring because it showed that humans were willing to click into nature and to observe what nature needed to thrive, and then humans provided it, and nature indeed did thrive. It's just one example of how the balance of nature can find its footing again when humans work in harmony with what already exists, instead of taking resources out of an ecosystem or taking actions with no thought to the consequences. And I also have to just say I love how simple this solution was. They reintroduced one species and the whole system began to recover and thrive. I think it's amazing. Another inspiring example that I learned about from one of our episode guests, actually, focuses on an area of the ocean in the Gulf of California, off the western Mexican coast. This is known as the Cabo Pulmo Marine Protected Area. I learned about this from Jan and Matt, our guests from Reef Check. If you didn't catch the Reef Check episode, a Marine Protected Area, or MPA, is an area of the ocean where fishing and other human activity is limited, or banned even, so that human impact is lessened and the ecosystems can recover and behave as they're meant to naturally. It's the ocean equivalent of a protected national park, essentially, where hunting and other human activity is restricted. Just 25 years ago, the ecosystem in the local reef and surrounding ocean in this Cabo Pulmo Marine Protected Area was in desperate shape. Sharks had disappeared, and sharks are very important to an ecosystem, in a similar way to wolves are, as a top predator. It's part of the balance. Corals in this part of the ocean were covered in unproductive algae, which fish would typically eat, but the fish were disappearing because of overfishing and an imbalance in the ecosystem. Coral bleaching, which is essentially coral death, was becoming more and more common, which meant that life was leaving this part of the ocean. The locals became concerned about the future of their food source, the wildlife that they depended on to survive in this part of the ocean off their coast. And with help from scientists around the globe and environmental organizations, they successfully lobbied the Mexican government to create this marine protected area so that their ocean would begin to thrive again. Ironically enough, this also happened in 1995. Within 10 years, scientists and locals were amazed at how quickly this ecosystem rebounded. It was called an oasis of life by those who were studying it. They noticed that fish populations increased by 460% over these 10 years, which meant that the fish had returned to levels of population which are shown in areas where there's little to no fishing at all. It had basically fully recovered. Many other species rebounded in numbers and presence, including whale sharks, sea turtles, humpback whales, and manta rays. The park now serves as a clear example of the power of nature to restore herself when human impact is controlled or limited, when humans work with nature rather than against nature. This was not easy for the locals, who truly had to fight to take back their local ecosystem, but now they benefit hugely from the influx of ecotourism that's sprung up, as this has become a pristine and beautiful part of the ocean for researchers and tourists to visit, and the locals no longer depend so much on fishing to sustain themselves, which actually improves the health of this part of the ocean as well. When we benefit nature, we benefit ourselves. When we see beyond challenges and look to solutions, we can make incredible improvements and amazing changes. And the changes sometimes can even be simple, in the way that it was with Yellowstone. If we just choose one area to rebuild and revitalize, it can impact the whole system. We don't know how big those ripples will be. One species, the gray wolf, revitalized an entire area of nature. We have the solutions. If we're just willing to face our problems truthfully and honestly and make the necessary improvements that are required beyond the acknowledgement of those problems. The understanding that I think is right in front of us, if we'll just acknowledge it, is that we have the means to solve every problem we face, no matter how big or scary they seem. And this is part of what drives our podcast and our creating of it. We want to prove that no problem is unsolvable, and that very few problems have not already been considered and solved on some level. If we can just have the vision to implement those solutions on a larger scale, we can make massive improvements. And at this time in history, I think we have the amazing ability, unlike ever before, to communicate across the world and coordinate on these solutions together, to learn from each other and help each other improve. What will we do with this opportunity? And yes, finding these solutions and implementing them requires big thinking and a certain amount of courage to face some big, scary, hairy, hard truths and problems. But not all of it has to be daunting or even negative. We have the opportunity to overhaul every aspect of life as we know it for the better. How exciting is that? If we just allow our imaginations to light up a bit and to think of what the world could look like, could be, if everyone had enough food, or if every person was truly given the resources they needed to reach their potential, if every environmental system was strong because we gained enough understanding to work with it to ensure that our planet could thrive while we get what we need too. If peace was built into the way we behaved every day, rather than this idea that war and violence are inevitable or something that we just do as part of human nature. I want to challenge that idea and other ideas that keep us limited, that keep us powerless and helpless. Our world can become an incredible place to inhabit. Every difficult aspect of what we see around us can just be the fuel that inspires amazing amounts of invention and innovation. We already have so many examples of people who have worked to understand a problem well enough to solve it just by using their creativity, by allowing their ideas to spark and then building what they're inspired to build. We've heard from guests on this show, like Robert Lee of RLC, Rescuing Leftover Cuisine, who has pinpointed this truth that we have enough food to feed everyone globally by just refusing to waste any more food. We'll hear from Keegan soon, the co-director of the documentary film Cowspiracy, that we have more than enough food in the form of grain and other food sources to feed the world right now, if we just funnel our resources better. We know that we can prevent ocean plastic from accumulating any more than it already has, and we learned that from Emma, from Final Straw. She helped us to understand the role that companies can play in transforming our products so that plastic is no longer a problem and stays that way. We know from Jan and Matt of Reef Check that our oceans are incredibly resilient if we just give them the time and space away from human intervention to recover. Kenneth from Hempies shared all of the potential that hemp has to reduce our use of harmful chemicals, to cut back on clearing forests, to increase our food supply, and so much more. And these are just a few of thousands of ideas and stories out there that can and are improving our world. We have the answers. It's just a matter of agreeing that creating these solutions is more important than protecting the status quo. And it's a matter of seeing past our challenges, allowing our challenges to help us grow, rather than getting stuck in this place where we're just going in circles, talking about what's difficult and what's wrong. The choice is up to us. We choose how to behave as people, as consumers, as business people, as business builders, and as participants in our lives and in our societies, our world. Every action we take is a choice. Every action we take is a statement about who we are and who we want to be. The question in front of us now is, will we inform every choice we make with the impact it has on the greater community and make the best choice possible? Or will we continue to live as though we're separate from each other and from nature, as though we don't know better when we do? That's really, I think, at the heart of most, if not all, of our problems. We're not separate from anything truly. We're all part of this system, and we all have the ability to choose better, to be better. If we can have the courage to face the truth of our current challenges and then the vision to create something better, we can make a more beautiful and equitable world than any of us have dreamed of yet. It's just about choosing how we're going to relate to these challenges and then taking action to be constructive and be solution-oriented rather than focusing only on the problems. Whew. I talked at you a lot, but as you can see, I'm really passionate about this. I really believe that there's so much more potential than poverty. There's so much more possibility than disempowerment out there if we just cultivate the right mindset and then take whatever action we're inspired to take. Thank you so much for hearing me out. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this conversation. Thank you for making whatever steps you can make to create a better world from your perspective, and for making a commitment not to get bogged down in the problems, but to choose to see what's past them. we're sending all of the love and peace that we have to give to each and every one of you around the globe, and especially to folks in countries like Brazil and the US who are really struggling right now to adapt and overcome. Let's take this opportunity to increase our compassion for those who are doing their best to make the best decisions right now, given their view of the world. And let's be sure we're taking the best possible care we can of ourselves and our communities as our immediate situation continues to unfold each day. We hope you'll join us for our next episode featuring the director, writer, and producer of the Netflix documentary Heal, which tells several amazing stories about the power we have to transform our health for the better, way beyond what any of us have been taught. And if you're enjoying the stories we're telling, we, as always, would be incredibly grateful if you'd subscribe to our show, leave us a review on whichever listening platform you use, give us a rating, and share our stories with your family and friends so that we can continue this conversation. We can help it to grow. We want to tell these stories of solution builders who are so inspiring and so amazing and help spread the word about the work that they're doing to make this world a better place. We want to inject the world with as much hope and truth and empowering information as we can in the middle of everything that's going on. And we hope that we inspire you to do the same. We're so fortunate to have had such amazing guests and that we continue to get such amazing people. And we want these stories to get spread around. They deserve to be told. Thank you again. Take care of yourselves. And until next time.